Sweet Lord Almighty, did Coleman feel like absolute shit. The man rubbed his bruised and tender chest, wondering how long it was going to take him to recover from his broken ribs. Coleman couldn't help but think whoever performed CPR on him must have been the most roided-out bodybuilder on base. "You'll be fine. I just gave you a healthy dose of painkillers." His assigned doctor noticed the discomfort on his face. "So, no operating any vehicles or weapons, and make sure you don't go to your barracks alone." There were just a few more tests they had to run on Coleman to make sure he wasn't dying horribly before they could release him. "Plus, your special someone is waiting for you in the lobby," the doctor winked. Coleman raised an eyebrow at that, but decided it wasn't worth asking. He didn't exactly have the energy to raise a fuss. Yeah, I get it, Doc. Let's just get this over with," the sergeant said dismissively, opting to let her poke and prod him as she pleased. And poking and prodding she did. The doctor took an hour to run every test she could possibly safely perform in order to ensure the health of her patient. Not that Coleman appreciated her efforts. The disgruntled man was too busy being miserable from the after-effects of an opioid-addled overdose and subsequent violent resurrection. With a final beep from the doctor's scan, she gave Coleman a wry smile and gently patted him on the back. "All right, we're done here." She awkwardly tried to remain upbeat. Coleman turned his head and gave the doctor a tired, but knowing look. "It happens, Doc. This isn't the first time your sedatives killed me," he said, waving his hand. "I'm just glad I didn't shit myself." The tarry doctor's motion came to an abrupt stop, and her face started to twitch as shame started to fill her. Is that so?" Her voice started to trail off. Coleman scratched his head. "Don't worry about it, Doc. It was a long time ago, before anyone knew humans could overdose on your mixtures." He did his best to comfort her. His attempt seemed to have the opposite effect as the doctor's ears started to slowly droop downwards, and hers had a vacant look. Let's just get you home. There's someone waiting for you," she said, standing up. Coleman decided that the best course of action was to just shut the fuck up and get the fuck out of there. Every move was the wrong move. The only thing he could do was escape from the situation and pass the buck to someone else. With shaky legs, Coleman managed to stand up and follow the doctor out of the examination room. The doctor put on her best smile and pointed him towards the exit before turning her heels and going through the staff room door. Coleman looked back one last time and watched as the door started to hiss shut, but he could see a gaggle of nurses turn pale when they saw who entered. "All you useless shits are going to repeat phase 1 after—" The doctor's angry screams were cut off by the shutting doors. "Fucking yikes, my dude," Coleman said to himself while picking up the pace. Wobbling through the main lobby, Coleman remembered the doctor's words and looked over at the waiting area to look for who was waiting for him. "Lyria? What are you doing here?" he called out. Lyria's head shot up, not expecting to be addressed, and her eyes started swimming as she tried to figure out what to say. Hello, Sergeant Coleman. Funny meeting you here." She immediately got up, scratching the back of her head. Coleman's eyes just twitched after experiencing such an insane cliché. "You were waiting for me, weren't you?" he said, deadpanned. Her eyes widened, and her face flushed deeply at being caught. She'd been practicing that line for the entire day, and he immediately called her out. "How did he know?" Lyria screamed in her own head. Her mouth flapped while her brain ran a mile a minute, trying to find an excuse or a way out. Seeing the distraught he caused, Coleman decided to throw her a bone and waved his hand towards the exit. "Since you've come for me, let's go get some food," he said, making his way outside. Events were moving so fast, Lyria's brain began to short-circuit. Okay." She didn't have time to think about it as the man walked through the sliding doors. The moment Coleman took his first step outside, he put his hand out to protect his eyes from the blinding sun. It felt as if a flashbang detonated right in front of his face, magnifying his already existing headache to an unreasonable degree. "Fucking hell, was it always this bright out?" he complained, squinting his eyes. Lyria's face filled with concern when she saw Coleman flinch away from the sky and covered his face with his hands. "Are you all right?" she asked, putting her hands on his shoulder. "Yeah," Coleman replied grumpily. "I just need a shitload of water and some food." Bringing his hand down, the miserable man started walking in the direction of an Imperial automated side-by-side. Do you want to stop by the cafeteria then? Lyria asked, following him. Coleman stopped, turned around to look at Lyria, and thought for a moment. As appealing as that sounded, he needed to get back to the barracks and make sure his guys weren't tearing everything apart. He needed to get back. He wasn't so irresponsible as to leave Elijah alone for more than a few minutes and expect anything good to come out of it. Yeah, food sounds pretty nice. Coleman didn't even give it a second thought when he got into the vehicle. It's a date. Lyria flushed deeply at the date part and hurriedly jumped in next to him. Yeah, fuck that, I just fucking died, Coleman thought to himself. Coleman decided it just wasn't his problem right now. They could delay dealing with Elijah bullshit for a little while longer. They made it sound like he was even able to stop whatever crazy bullshit was brewing inside that madman's head. That crackhead created a goddamn pastry empire, bribing and compromising every level of command all the way up to the field officers. That fucker's career was littered with bullshit like this, and the only thing he would get was a demotion. All because he had a ranger tab. Elijah should have been a staff sergeant by now, but he just couldn't stop being a bastard. Fucking ridiculous. Coleman felt the vehicle gently lurch into motion towards his version of heaven when Lyria played with the console, inputting their destination. But he couldn't talk too much shit. The medic had saved his and everyone else's ass in the platoon more times than anyone could count throughout the years. It wasn't long until they came to a gentle rolling stop in front of what Coleman considered the Promised Lands. And the moment they entered the massive building, he just wanted to get on his knees and kiss the hard marble-like floor. To make things better, Coleman noticed the massive building was nearly empty. Only a sparse few Tari and Uvil dotted the countless rows of lunch tables. One had to wonder, since they had multiple of these things dotted around the base, why did they make them all so big? A question he would have answered at a later time, for there awaited food and he would not be denied. Kuribayashi locked the door behind her the moment she stepped into Elijah's room. Well, it's not fresh, but I've got some meat buns. Elijah bent over, rummaging through the small fridge he had in the living room. Realizing he wasn't getting an answer, he turned around with a meat bun in his hands to see Kuribayashi was still leaning against his door, staring at him with hungry eyes. She bit down on her lip while her eyes traveled up and down Elijah's body with her head tilted downwards. Well, I am hungry, Kuribayashi said in a low, sultry voice. Elijah stood there like a deer in the headlights, while Kuribayashi gingerly pushed herself off the door and started to slowly walk towards him. But not for this. She plucked the meat bun from his hands and placed a single finger on his chest. Turning beet red, Elijah's eyes began swimming around, trying to comprehend what was happening. Kuribayashi was equally red, but she tilted her head up to look at her victim and gave him a luring smirk. Now, which one's your room? Her voice had a low rumble that would make any man's heart pound. Elijah gulped and turned his head to look at the door behind him. With a widening smile, Kuribayashi followed his gaze to the door and pushed her finger until her hand was flush over his chest. She could feel Elijah's heart pound viciously on the other side of his uniform when she started to push him backwards towards his room. Kuribayashi giggled as she slowly undid the buttons of her field jacket, her heart pounding just as hard as his. Her jacket hit the floor when Elijah came to a stop, but she kept creeping forward until her chest was pressed against his. Well, are you going to open the door? She asked coyly, wrapping her hands around his back. Elijah's lizard brain was in full control when his hand started smacking around looking for the doorknob. Even though he was becoming frustrated from his lack of coordination, Kuribayashi just giggled more until he finally got the damned thing and promptly used her body weight to push him inside. When she shut the door behind him with her foot, Elijah remembered one simple fact of life. Good things do happen sometimes. So, there is a NSFW section right here. Unfortunately, due to community guidelines, I can't actually include it in the video. So, this is your opportunity to sign up for Patreon and check it out there. Now, back to the story. Lyria couldn't help but be equally terrified when she saw Coleman virtually ravage his plates in the same fashion that she saw First Lieutenant Zolnak devour his own meal. She heard rumors of the good lieutenant's extended embedding into the human units, and she couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection. Did all humans eat like that? Oh man, that was amazing! Coleman nearly yelled, leaning back. Lyria was pulled out of her thoughts and snapped her head up in surprise. She had momentarily forgotten who she was with for a moment, trying to unravel the mysteries of the human dietary habits and its effects on other beings. "Do you know how long I'd been eating trash-ass fabricated food?" He started to vent his frustrations while rubbing his belly. "We touched down in lizard territory to pull out some recon team that got fucked up and got pulled into some, what's that word?" Coleman started making a motion with his hands. You put meat into it and grind it." Lyria looked at him as if he was crazy, after being blasted with a machine gun of accented words, and tried to decipher what he was trying to tell her. Meat grinder?" she asked with twitching ears. "Yeah, that." Coleman snapped his fingers and pointed at her. Not used to such strange and alien actions, Lyria jumped at the sound. It appeared that Coleman either didn't notice or ignored the fact that he had startled the poor woman, and kept up his recanting of his experiences. "So, no shit, there I was," he continued, acting out the event. "For an entire week, I was sitting in a pit full of nothing but cold-ass mud, while taking goddamn fucking rounds by a bunch of fucking lizards in the middle of the goddamn jungle." As Coleman told his tale, an alarmed expression started to form across Lyria's face as she listened to the madness. She couldn't understand how he could still be sane after enduring the horrors of that much sustained combat, and let alone be so cavalier about it. Then again, Lyria had to consider, was he even sane? "That's not all." Coleman's hand slammed down on the table, jostling the trays and plates. Lyria recoiled at the aggression, and became genuinely nervous after seeing the near-rabid look in his eyes. That's not all?" she stammered. "Do you know what we did after they tried to launch an offensive with tunnels?" Coleman started to lean in closer to Lyria, leaning backwards to keep distance from the man as he leaned in closer and closer. The poor Tari girl couldn't help but wonder if she was in danger. What? She began to sweat nervously. Lyria was leaning back so far, her back was starting to hurt, but Coleman's face was getting closer and closer. "We went down and chased him." Coleman's words had a dark and sinister tone to them. No. The answer was no. This man was definitely not sane. Her expression remained neutral as she listened to Coleman's battle in the tunnels, but her eyes were nearly bulging out of her head. It was unbelievable enough that these humans endured a week of constant combat, but the fact they chased the scourge down into their very own tunnels was pure madness. To make it worse, the man had started going off on a tangent about tunnel rats, and how they would perform underground search and destroy missions during one of their intraspecies wars. Lyria couldn't help but think it was a grave mistake, falling for a man from a species that had named a profession for chasing subterranean combatants through their burrows. But forget about that. I'm just glad I can see your face again. Coleman leaned back into his chair to relax. To be honest, I think the thought of talking to you again kept me alive. Caught off guard by how direct Coleman was, Lyria nearly dropped to the floor before she managed to put her hands to cover her blush. It was far too late for regrets, though. She was already smitten by the man. "Oh, stop!" she whimpered, covering her face. "I'm serious," Coleman continued. "I would just say, one more day and I'll get to hear her voice every time things got bad." It seemed he didn't even care anymore while laying it on thick. After already facing death several times over, it seemed like saying how you felt was the easiest thing in the world. Nothing could scare him, and nothing seemed impossible after that. At least, while the man was still riding the high of his painkillers and the aftershock of the overdose. Lyria couldn't help but be left speechless. Having a male be this aggressive was almost unheard of outside of dating and romance simulations. Everything was thrown for a loop. There was a process to courtship, and Coleman just skipped several steps and went straight to intimacy. "I don't know how you feel, but..." Coleman looked away and started tapping on the table. Still covering her face with her hands out of embarrassment, Lyria couldn't resist to peek through her fingers at the human. Her therapist had warned her about humans. They were scandalously brazen and were quick to break hearts, males and females. However, Lyria never took the therapist's advice seriously, especially at the mention of one-night stands. Nevertheless, she had heard numerous stories from sailors docking on human worlds, of males seducing an unsuspecting Tari girl and disappearing the next day, never to be seen again. Emperor forbid the stories of humans leading a Tari on for numerous rendezvous, only to shatter the poor girl's heart by telling her he wasn't interested in a relationship. For the sake of her family and honor, Lyria needed to remain vigilant and sniff out any ill intentions this man might have. She swore an oath in her heart that she wouldn't be so easily swooned by a cute face and honeyed words by this swindler. "I really like spending time with you," Coleman continued. "I think you're beautiful and amazing." A weird voice escaped Lyria's lips as she covered her eyes again, and as soon as the oath was made, the oath was broken. Lyria could do nothing but curse herself when she literally felt the hearts forming in her eyes as Coleman continued to confess his feelings. The only thing she could do now was hope he was genuine and wanted to take it further, because Lyria knew self-control was no longer an option. I need to get going." Coleman cut her musing short by immediately standing up. She couldn't help but notice his pale face start to turn red in a deep blush. "I need to get back and make sure everything isn't on fire." He tried to make an excuse to escape the situation. However, the moment Coleman took a step, he nearly lost his balance and grabbed the table to steady himself. Lyria was already in action, putting her arm around his waist to steady him. Be careful," she chided. Coleman had his hand on his head, finally understanding why the doctor insisted on him not going back alone. "Oh man, she gave me some dank shit," he said aloud. Lyria tilted her head at him curiously, not understanding a word he said. "Dank?" She tried pronouncing the alien word. Coleman waved his hand in a dismissive manner, in an effort to avoid explaining how complicated and weird human nomenclature was. Don't worry about it. It's a human thing." He cut her off before she asked any questions. "Say, do you want to do me a favor?" He turned his head and looked at her expectantly. Lyria was still curious about that odd-sounding word, but her curiosity immediately shifted to what the man needed help with. "Can you help me back to my room?" he asked with an apologetic look. Okay." Lyria responded with an unassuming smile, not fully understanding what he was asking. The poor woman's brain seemed to blue screen as she stared blankly at Coleman with an awkward smile still plastered over her face. "Thanks, I'm just a little wobbly, so I just need you to make sure I don't fall flat on my face," he said while trying to right himself. Okay, that's no problem," she said cheerfully, completely on autopilot. When the two made their way outside and walked towards the automated vehicle, Lyria began to ponder on what exactly Coleman meant by his room. Lyria's brain ran through every possible interpretation of "help me back to my room" she could think of as she sat down next to the human. She was mostly convinced that Coleman misspoke. Considering his level of understanding of Imperial Standard, that had to be the only explanation. An awkward smile formed across Lyria's face, trying to cover an internal cringe. She nearly had jumped to conclusions and made a fool of herself. However, as Lyria was musing to herself, Coleman couldn't help but raise an eye at the moment they passed the open gate, an empty guardhouse. That's strange," he quietly muttered to himself. Where were the MPs? As a matter of fact, the usually bustling base seemed like a ghost town while they were driving through. Coleman reached into his pocket for his datapad, thinking there must have been a base-wide memo, but he found his pockets to be empty. Right, left it in my room," he thought to himself. He tended to not bring anything that emitted light when outside of the wire, to maintain light discipline. There had been innumerous times where not having anything that emitted light saved his life when a lizard would walk by him. "Is everything all right? Do you feel pain anywhere?" Lyria noticed Coleman pat himself down. No, I'm fine," he reassured, raising his hand. Well, I'm still a little dizzy, but I forgot something in my room. We're almost there, so it's no big deal," he continued. Wait, that word again. Room. Lyria opened her mouth to ask for further clarification, but was cut off by the vehicle coming to a stop in front of a building, with more humans coming out. Ugh, I'm so stuffed. Coleman hopped out and started to stretch. Do you want to come in? Distress started to spread across Lyria's face when she finally comprehended where she was and what she was doing. Wait, you want me to go up to your room? Where you sleep? Lyria almost yelled. Coleman flopped his arms to his side in a lazy manner, and looked back at Lyria with a bewildered expression. Yes? He clarified. All the blood went rushing to Lyria's face upon hearing the answer. As a single woman, it was highly improper for her to enter a male's room, let alone an unmarried male's room. Her mouth started to flop as her brain scrambled to find the words to respond, but Coleman simply shrugged and threw his hand forward to indicate that she should follow. The man started making his way to the front door in an unsteady fashion, which prompted Lyria to get out of her seat.
Wait, Sergeant Coleman?
Lyria started to protest when she jogged up next to Coleman and put her hand on his back to steady the man.
Are you sure this is okay?
Coleman just looked at her as if she was insane, unsure what she was freaking out about. Yes, I don't see why it wouldn't be okay, he responded, mystified by her reluctance. Stunned into a nervous silence, Lyria had no other choice but to accept her fate and help the inebriated human up several flights of stairs to his room. The stairs were deemed to be the most challenging obstacle for Coleman, when every step caused one of his legs to wobble unsteadily. Luckily, he had his trusty assistant right by him, who acted as a safety net all the way up. Lyria was an anxious wreck each step of the way up, but her stress hit a crescendo when she saw him open the door. Coleman just simply strolled inside, as if there was absolutely nothing wrong with the situation, and shed his boots at the door. "What are you waiting for? Come in," he said, going further in. Scanning every inch of the room the moment she walked through the threshold, Lyria's eyes couldn't stop swimming. She held her hands close to her chest to help ease her racing heart, thinking something was going to jump out at her. But it was far too late to turn back now. "Really, Eli?" Coleman complained, picking up a field jacket off the floor. Lyria watched him freeze and began to study the thing, as if there was something wrong with it. However, the intense look only lasted a few seconds when his shoulder went up in a shrug. It seemed his interest went as fast as it came. The man tossed the thing onto a nearby chair, choosing to deal with it at a later date. Sit down and relax," Coleman said while walking to his room. "I'm going to grab something from my room real quick and we can continue talking." The moment he said that, however, a loud and drawn-out grunt came from the door on the opposite side of the room. The two immediately snapped their heads towards where the offending sound came from, and stared at it for a few seconds. "Eli?" Coleman called out. After a few moments of waiting and no reply, Coleman scratched his head in bemusement. Elijah would usually open the door and throw something at him, or curse at him in a friendly manner whenever someone called for him. Coleman, sensing something wrong, considered going in and checking on the medic. There was a chance he got a dose of Tari sedatives. However, the moment he took a step away from his room, another wave of disorientation crept back in. Can you go and make sure the idiot isn't dead?" Coleman asked, holding his head. Lyria snapped her head towards the man and looked at him as if he was completely insane.
No. I can't just barge into a male's room unannounced," she protested.
Coleman closed his eyes and began rubbing his head, trying to get his faculties back. "Oh, come on, he isn't going to care," he dismissed her worries. "You're just going to make sure he isn't drowning in a pool of his own puke." Understanding that was a reasonable worry, considering what happened to him, Lyria was still apprehensive about barging into a man's room. But at the moment, she could hear another wave of moans and grunts with her sensitive ears. Swallowing her gripes, Lyria gave in and started to hesitantly approach the room, telling herself it's just to check on the man's status. She wasn't creeping or peeping. Lyria's shaking hands finally grabbed a hold of the doorknob and gently pushed it open.
Corporal Drake?"
she called out, poking her head through the door. But when the interior came into her vision, Lyria indeed found the corporal healthy and hale. However, there was a problem. He wasn't alone in the room.
I'm sorry,"
she screamed, slamming the door shut.